विग्रहं त्रिनयनं माणिक्यमौली स्फुरत् तारानायकशेखरां स्मितमुखीमां मीनवक्षोरुहां पाणिभ्यामलिपूर्णरत्नचषकं रक्तोत्पलं सौम्यां रत्नघटस्थरक्तचरणां ध्यायेत् परामम्बिकाम् सततज्वर विषमज्वर ग्रह नक्षत्र दोषाञ्चान्या हर हर काली सर सर गौरी गम गम विद्ये आले माले काले बन्धे भज भज विद्ये मख मख विद्ये नाशय नाशय पापं हर हर दुःस्वप्नं विध्वंसय विध्वंसय
Namaste, dear friends. Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Om salutations to our Gurus. Today is the 28th day of this Yogathon, of the Global Festival of Yoga, celebrating wellness. This program, as you are already aware, is being organized by the Indica Yoga. Indica Yoga is a platform that is dedicated to promoting authentic, immersive, and transformative yogic practices and teachings. So far on our journey, we've had experts from different backgrounds sharing with us on a diversity of approaches to yoga, techniques, and teachings. But there are some questions that remain unanswered, like what is the future of yoga? Have the aims been established and the methods been found? Is it to follow the ancient paths all that is left for each one of us to accomplish? Or are there still greater heights to be scaled? Humanity is going through an unprecedented outer and inner change. Where could it be heading? What role is there for us? What role is there for yoga in this radically new phase of our collective adventure of consciousness and joy? In today's session, Dr. Matthijs Cornelisen will explore these pertinent questions. May I request Dr. Matthijs Cornelisen to please come on screen? The question that we are going to explore is going to be under the heading of yoga in the context of an ongoing evolution of consciousness. A small note about Dr. Matthijs Cornelisen, whom we fondly call Matthijs Bhai, because he's been a teacher, a friend, a mentor, a guide, many things in one. And it's a great pleasure to present him to the world audience. Dr. Matthijs Cornelisen completed his medical education in Amsterdam, and he was struck by a few important questions, like, why do we really have to die? Why is there disease? The same questions that troubled Gautama Buddha. He read certain texts on these questions, but did not find answers that were enough in themselves. So his search brought him to India, where he came and settled in 1977. He is deeply interested in the work of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, and how it can transform us both individually and collectively. In 2006, he founded the Indian Psychology Institute in Pondicherry, where he is also a teacher at the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education, which is my alma mater. At present, he is trying to help with the creation of a radically new foundation for psychology based on Sri Aurobindo's Vedic vision of a still ongoing evolution of consciousness. With these few words, I'd like to hand over the session to Dr. Matthijs Cornelisen, and he's going to share on yoga in the context of an ongoing evolution of consciousness. So Matthijs Bhai, over to you. I would just like to mention to our audience that if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A box that is there. Thank you. So over to you, Matthijs Bhai.
Okay. Good morning to all of you and to me also. I would like to talk to you a little bit about the context of yoga and the background philosophy. And I would like to introduce it more like a question than as a statement. So I hope we have a lively discussion either during or at the end of my presentation. When we think of yoga, we automatically think of well-being, of happiness, and all that kind of things, because for almost everybody, yoga is a good thing in their life. But yoga was not only meant for that. There is more to it. Its literal meaning, as I think most of you will know, is connection, union, and especially union with the divine. In that sense, interestingly, it means actually the same as religion, which is also, originally it means to relink yourself to the divine. So somewhere in us, all of us know that there is something more sacred, more eternal, something infinite, of which we are a part, or at least to which we are very close, even if we cannot immediately see it outside of us. And yoga, and to some extent religion, are approaches to find that. Yoga, because it looks for something infinite and eternal, also has the connotation of being eternal. So when we study it, we look for old text, and the older the better. We have the idea that yoga has always been the same. But that's actually not the case. Most yoga scriptures or traditions have started at a very specific point, and over time, quite a lot changed in the way the people did yoga or followed the different traditions. So I think it is useful to start with a very short overview of history. Now that's kind of intriguing because modernity has a very different sense of history than the Indian tradition. Modernity thinks in terms of progress. But interestingly, that whole idea of progress is only 500 years old. Before that, even in Europe, people thought that the golden age was in the past and that we are actually living in a time of decline. But okay, since 500-600 years, we think in terms of progress. And in certain areas, the progress is phenomenal, unprecedented, and going faster and faster. The very simple examples. People started taming and breeding horses about 6,000 years ago. Before that, the fastest you could go was to run, and that you couldn't do for very long. So people could walk about 30, 40 kilometers a day, but that was about it. With a horse, you could do more. 200 years ago, 190, we had trains that suddenly could go faster than horses. That was quite phenomenal. Only 60 years, no, what is it? Yeah, something like that. About 120 years ago, we started making aeroplanes. And since 1960, aeroplanes can go about 500 times as much in one day as they could at that time, before we had anything. So in transport, something has changed very radically. It means that basically in one day you can reach anywhere on the planet. And in ordinary communication, the changes are still much, much better or much faster. Till very recently, about say 190 years or so, 180 years ago, nobody could give a signal, a physical signal, maybe by telepathy, but not physically, beyond the range of sight and the range of hearing. Then Morse code came. And that was a radical thing because we could suddenly send a signal that would reach instantly, way beyond the range of sight and hearing. And in a ridiculous 40 years later, we had telephone and then radio, and suddenly one person could talk something that basically anybody on the planet could hear at the same time. And the end of that technology is that we now can send billions of messages and video around the world every single day. So something is changing. About 50 years ago, 50 years ago, I was in some small villages in North India, where most people who were living there had never, ever been outside of their village and its immediate surrounding. They were 100% local. Some of the men would go once in a while to the town, which was 4 or 5 kilometers away. And some of the women would have come from another village, one journey of maybe 30, 40 kilometers, but only once in their life. Otherwise, everybody lived only in the one place where they were living, and the rest of the world was mythical. Now in those same villages, there is bound to be television. Many people will have mobiles. And so the people spend part of their day in Bollywood and in New York and Hollywood and anywhere. So we have changed. Sorry, there was a message on the screen which didn't make any sense to me. Okay, so we have changed. None of us is local anymore. We are all global, we are all connected. It means we have still cultures that are different, just like individuals have different characters. Groups also have different characters. But nobody is limited anymore to his own culture. And that is only since a very, very short period. Another radical change is that till about 12,000 years ago, we had no agriculture. So everybody was basically eating and living from what nature provided, just like all the other animals. There were no villages, there were no towns. There was never a meeting of more than a few hundred people because it was technically not possible. And we lived in a situation that was given. Now we live in a situation that is almost entirely man-made. There's a good chance that you don't see anything right now which is not man-made. If you're lucky, there's some trees outside or some plants inside, but they're also there because humans have allowed them to be there. And we can make almost anything we can think of within a few years of thinking of it. So we have suddenly become tiny co-creators of the world. And with that has come a responsibility. One of the remarkable things is that thanks to the French Revolution and political changes, democracy, we take it for granted that we have a collective responsibility for the future of humanity and even for the future of the planet. It has never been like that. Earlier, we were basically only responsible for ourselves and at most for our family, but not beyond that. A king could be responsible for a small kingdom. But even those kings who thought that they were ruling the world were always ruling only a small part of the world. So something has changed. We have become active. We have become dynamic. We have an influence on the world in which we live. Now, how does this relate to yoga? In the beginning of the Life Divine, the book that Sri Aurobindo wrote to explain some of his philosophy, he outlines 3 basic ways of looking at the world and understanding how the world as a whole works. The way of science is that the world is basically physical, and even our consciousness is basically made by the mind and by the brain and how the brain works. There is another approach, which is that of exclusive spirituality, which says that basically the world is made out of consciousness and everything is basically only there in our minds. There are 2 very different ways of looking at the world. They're almost each other's mirror images. And then there is a third one, which fully accepts that there is a physical world, which is, it sees it as a manifestation of consciousness. And it kind of combines the physical and the spiritual path without accepting their denial of each other. Both the physical and the exclusive spirituality traditions see consciousness largely as something passive, watching, but not directly influential of anything. The integral tradition accepts that consciousness is also a power. Most Indian traditions are somewhere between the exclusive and the integral pole. The question is, where are we within these 3 schemes? And how does the world actually work? According to the Indian tradition, as I said in the beginning, history is going down. So the idea was that we had greater wisdom, greater harmony in the past, and then it gets worse and worse over time. Interestingly, that vision of history does not actually conflict with the modern idea of progress. There is an interesting overlap between the two. According to modern science, humans have not changed genetically much for the last 200,000 years. And we know virtually nothing of the first 180, 190,000 years. Nothing. 40,000 years ago, we could make paintings, of which a few have been left in caves. 12,000 years, we started agriculture. With that came villages, houses, towns, kingdoms, hierarchies, inheritance, and probably a lot of the difficulties that we at present have. It is very possible that till 12,000 years ago, there was a kind of harmony, the same kind of harmony that you find in nature. Maybe because our minds were not yet messing up everything. It is possible that we have learned that only over the last 12,000 years. And now we do it big scale. So three things have changed. Time is going faster and faster, which is very fascinating because we seem to have reached a point where change is going almost vertical. We have become responsible. And interestingly, with all the increased intelligence that we have, we are messing up. We need to change. Because if we remain doing what we are doing, we will destroy the very world in which we live. So the traditional solution of just getting out of the trouble by finding a place that is eternal, that is not concerned about anything, that will not any longer do. And this whole wide world cannot have been created by the consciousness that we can reach at our very best. Because at the moment, the type of consciousness that we can reach is of two very different types. We can know the world around us. And modernity has developed that kind of knowledge phenomenally. But it is all the knowledge that in the Indian tradition was called avidya, because it is the knowledge of the many. But in modern times, we have much better figured out how that kind of knowledge actually works. And basically it works because our brains make a model of the world in which we live. And most of the time, we are only aware of that model. So what we take for the world is actually our image of that world. And so Shankara was right that we live in a falsehood. We live in an imitation reality. We are not, at least not very much and not in detail, aware of the world. We are aware of the model that we make of the world. And that is a second-hand reality. It is not, the content of it is a construction. It is, as the modern social sciences say, all constructed knowledge. The other kind of knowledge that we can have is knowledge of the eternal, of the infinite. But there's a gap between these two. The knowledge of the many, in the way we have it, is our constructed knowledge. The knowledge of the one, of the divine, of eternity, of perfection, we reach by excluding. We reach it by focusing. We reach it by attempting to reach purity, kaivalya. And interestingly, we can do that. We can, if we follow the path of Jnana Yoga, we can exclude our sensations, our feelings, our thoughts, and we kind of jump to a totally different kind of consciousness, that is the consciousness of the transcendent, of the divine, beyond the manifest reality. We can also follow the path of bhakti, of love, and love the divine so much that everything else melts away in that. But both approaches, though they find the absolute, they do find the divine. It's possible for humans to do that. But it is always only one aspect of the divine. And the divine is ananta guna. The divine is infinite. So to find the divine is in a way the solution. And if you figure out that your ego really doesn't exist, and that either there is complete emptiness, or everything is the divine, or whatever idea you have about the ultimate reality, you're fine. Your problems are solved. But you have not understood how the divine has created the world. You can still not look at the manifestation the way the divine does. Because our present consciousness does not allow that. Our brains don't do it. Our brains make a limited model. And as long as we deal with the multitude, with the many, with the differentiation, we are stuck to that second-hand constructed mental knowledge. And the real knowledge, the knowledge by being, we can have in its perfection only when it is one-pointed. And obviously the divine is also one-pointed, but also many-pointed, because the divine has manifested the reality as a whole. And you can see that in spite of whatever people have thought about reality, the world as a whole is phenomenally beautiful and is a perfect harmony and is complex to a level that is entirely beyond our capacity to follow. So the world has not been created by consciousness as we know it. Neither by that infinite transcendent, nor by the limited dualistic knowledge that is part of our ordinary life. There is something in between. Sri Aurobindo lived a very different life than most of us. He started yoga when he was already fairly old, in his 30s or 40s, I think. But in a very short time, he had the highest possible realizations. But instead of relaxing and teaching, he realized that he got those realizations by making a jump, by going somewhere else. And that from those realizations, the world looked unreal. And something in him was not satisfied with that. And so he spent the next 40 years of his life exploring the space between that transcendent and the many. And he found that there was a whole world in between, with an infinite number of layers of consciousness. And then when he started reading the Rig Veda, he realized that some of these old rishis knew that place. They described it. And so he got quite fascinated with that type of consciousness. And then he saw that we might have reached that point at the end of the Kali Yuga, where there is a radical change possible. And that maybe, initially he thought maybe, later he got completely convinced that it was simply destined. there is a possibility for us to flip or slowly grow from our present dualistic consciousness to something that includes the non-dual consciousness that all the ancient Indian sages had, and arrive at a new kind of consciousness that fills the gap between the transcendent and the world. So that we can actually learn to look at the world, understand the world, and live in the world in the way that the divine does it. And he came to the conclusion that that is as radically different from what we have now as the difference more or less from plant to human. It is a radical gap and far more radical than people seem to realize. And so he spent his time trying to explain how humans can allow ourselves, can open up to that higher consciousness and allow that higher consciousness first to change our minds and then our feelings, our hearts, and in the end, even our body. And our body is very strange because we don't know our body. Everything that we think we know through that model-making brain of ours. And that provides an image. It doesn't provide a reality as it is from inside out. So we need a very radical change. And you can think and you can maybe hope that some of the changes that we see happening around us are actually signs that something special is happening. The enormous influx of ideas that takes place in the technical field, the incredible level of collaboration that we have. They say that to make one mobile, there are about 200,000 patents involved, which means that at least 200,000 people or something in that order have put their ideas into that one gadget. It is a level of collaboration that has never seen before. And also it is the first time that there is a collaboration of everybody in the world. That also has never been. At least not openly, not known. So maybe these are things that something radical is changing. But it means that we should get out of the self-sufficiency, out of the easygoingness by which we do a little bit of yoga, do a little bit of meditation and start feeling pretty good about ourselves. And that we try to reach a really radically higher consciousness. Or rather that we open ourselves up to be more and more influenced by that higher consciousness. So that the harmony that the world desperately needs is not anymore with a lot of difficulty, enforced, constructed, but comes kind of naturally to us. Because it is obviously the only way forward. So this is the scheme of things that I wanted to introduce to you or repeat to you if you already know it. And I hope we can have a discussion about it. I think I would like to stop here, and I'm very open to discussion and questions. Yeah? Anuradha, you would like to come in and guide the discussion?
Yes, I was just wondering, like Sri Aurobindo, I mean, first of all, thank you very much for that very clear presentation of uh, what has happened, where are we in this consciousness, in this evolution of consciousness, etc. The question that I have for you is again from Sri Aurobindo's work, where we'd like to request you to help us understand that how did Sri Aurobindo take this work forward? Like, how did he lay it out? Let's say in his important works like The Life Divine, The Synthesis of Yoga. So what are some of the important steps that he proposed could help us in very practical ways, help us realize this purpose?
Huh. I had for a long time someone in Delhi who was kind of a guide, or not fully a guru, but he helped me a lot on the way. And whenever I asked him this same question, how do you do it? What is the practical next step? He would always say, that doesn't matter. What you need is the will. Yeah? The Rig Veda, as far as I know, because I know hardly anything about it, starts with Agni. And Agni is the will. It is the inner fire that rises up to the light above. So it is an invocation of our deepest aspiration. The thing that we want from very deep inside our soul. And this person I talked about, he lived in Delhi. And so he gave a symbol and a metaphor that relates to people living in Delhi. So he said, if you want to go from Delhi to Pondicherry and you get into the wrong train, it doesn't matter at all. You will see Calcutta on the way. But you will still arrive in Pondi as long as your will is clear. But if your will is not clear, you can even get into the right train, but get out in Nagpur. Yeah. So in the end, it doesn't matter too much because the divine is all over the place. So whatever direction you will walk, you will always find him if you are bound to find him. So the critical issue is your will, is your aspiration. And then you need to be willing to chuck out of your system everything that stands in the way. And finally, you have to surrender to something that's way above you. So he said there are basically three things. There is your aspiration, which must be as high as your deepest soul tells you. There must be a rejection of everything that doesn't belong. And there must be surrender to that which already is you, is everything, already has it. And if you have these three things sufficiently, then your aspiration is answered by the divine. There is a grace that answers. And in the end of the process, you realize that even your aspiration was actually a grace. Because everything that is true and eternal in you is already from the divine. So in a way, you only need to realize what already is there. But you have to give up your surface thinking. You have to give up everything that you think you know. And you have to go to a radically deeper level of understanding. Does this make any sense?
Yes, very much. I think, first and foremost, thank you also for making us connect to Sri Aurobindo in a very real manner. It's not always very easy to access Sri Aurobindo's works, but thank you for making him very, very comprehensible, and the goal of what he's trying to talk about very much within our reach. You spoke of the divine, you spoke of consciousness, you spoke of the aspiration. There are a set of questions that I will combine, and you can take it up in the order that you think best. So we have a question from Forum Trivadiji, who's saying that, is the divine and consciousness the same? Then there's another question by Ravindra Murthy ji who says that, are you suggesting that there are different levels of consciousness? The term consciousness is a very tricky one. So that's the second one.
Okay.
And
These two can easily be combined.
and then the third one is by Sarika ji, who's saying all life events are life events predestined or a result of free will? Or what role does consciousness play in destiny versus free will? Thank you so much.
Okay. Let's start with the first one.
Yes.
The divine in the Indian tradition has very often been described as Sat Chit Ananda. So it means that the divine is indeed consciousness. There are many places where you can replace the word Brahman by the word consciousness and nothing goes wrong. The other part of it is, of course, that everything has the joy inside. That seems to be the opposite of what the Buddha said, that everything is temporary and suffering. But it has to do with how you measure joy. Yeah? In physics, we measure temperature in Kelvin, and nothing can have a temperature that is 0 because it won't exist. The joy that is there in Sat Chit Ananda is in the same way as is a kind of professional way of looking at joy. It is not the ordinary human way in which some things are pleasant and some things are not pleasant. So, okay, so the whole world is a manifestation of consciousness. The whole world is also the expression of a power. The trouble is that many people have taken consciousness as only awareness. And that creates a huge problem, almost as big as the modern problem that we take consciousness as something that's generated by the brain. If you take consciousness as something that's generated by the brain, you get into trouble because there's no way you can explain how consciousness works. It is almost as inappropriate as thinking that the Earth is the center of the universe and all the stars and the sun and the planets and everything else turns around us. As long as you think like that, you will never understand how physics works. So consciousness you can only understand when you understand that everything is conscious intrinsically because it is a manifestation of consciousness. And so you have to change the definition of consciousness because that means that our way of being conscious is just some kind of a middle term. Our consciousness is more complicated and sophisticated and this, that, and the other, but also much more often wrong than that of a rock. But it is not yet as comprehensive and as complete as the consciousness of the divine. So you have to take it that consciousness is basically the power that gives everything its qualities. So the consciousness in a rock is what allows that rock to know how to be a rock. Yeah? Having qualities and being an expression of power, these are two things that are actually identical. So in a rock, its consciousness is what tells us how to do it. And a rock is perfect in that. Simple physical things never make mistakes. They are always exactly what they are. We make mistakes because we identify with a brain that makes a model of the world, which is a constructed reality. It is a copy of the real reality. But we can get out of it. People who do gymnastics or who do ice skating or dancing, they can completely identify with the body and reach perfection in that. They are not anymore in that dual reality. They are just what they are and perfect. And it is a wonder to see. It is beautiful. Our ordinary mind is solidly dualistic. even if you try to express non-dual reality, you end up expressing it as your form of defining non-dual reality. When you have found a divine, before you know what has happened, you have found your divine. And you start talking about my divine as being better than your divine, and so on and so on. So we live in that half-baked world. But things were still perfect in the way they were. That was an expression of their consciousness. It was simple but perfect. We are complicated and very often wrong. And we have to get to a consciousness that is fully aware, intrinsically one with everything, and knowing everything. So if we come to the last question, the question of whether karma decides everything, my impression is that in India as a whole, the understanding of karma has changed radically over the last 50 years. Earlier, most people, as far as I knew, so it may have been not true, it may have been that other people thought about differently. Most people thought that karma determined everything, so that it didn't make much sense to even try to achieve anything because everything was already determined. Nowadays, people have found a much more clever explanation of karma. They say karma has determined how your life is right now. But what you do now determines your future. So suddenly the laws of karma still work. And yet you are free and you are responsible and you can decide your life. The understanding of karma is still there, but it has changed its practical consequences. The problem is the kind of thing that we think of as freedom are an illusion because we are part of God's plan and the world will run the way it runs. But as long as you have any sense of your own separate identity, then you have a responsibility also. And then you have karma and you can determine your karma for the future and you are responsible. Real freedom you only have when you identify fully with the divine. Then you're totally bound because you are completely determined by the plan that is there for the whole. And you're totally free. Below that level, your freedom is always an illusion because it is a freedom in which you may be free from outer influences, but you're still free, not free from your own neurosis and your own egoism. So that doesn't really help. The crux is to get rid of your ego. Then your fate doesn't matter to you anymore because it matters only as long as you have an ego that suffers. And you have the freedom to listen and to do what is needed. So then you are both free and bound, but you are bound to what you love. So there's no problem. Basically, we want to be free because we don't like the person who limits us. If you love someone, you don't mind being bound by that person. And if you love the divine, you're very happy to be bound. So it is not an answer maybe, or maybe an answer, I don't know. But again, the answer is in trying to look at it from another perspective. Yeah? Was there anything left for the question that needs to be done?
I think you covered it all very beautifully. And I've also mulled over this question of freedom, free will and all will, etc.
Everybody does.
Kind of the understanding that came to me, which satisfied my my comprehension of this relationship, is the fact that the freedom that we seem to have is to either align with that or not align with that.
Quite right. Yeah.
That's the only freedom we have. That we align with it now or not. And as in the Vedas, they say, that this yajna that they talk about, this moment-to-moment offering that is happening, It's something, it's not like a long-term plan that we have, but a moment-to-moment thing. I mean, the degree of that decision making is um, so dependent on every single moment of our lives, the extent of that decision making. So it's quite, and therefore the free will. And that was my thing. And I think you also very beautifully put it in the context of the fact that if you love the divine, if you love something, then the struggle of giving up of our liberty is not that much. So,
in the end, it is not there at all. The thing is, we are surrendered to something.
yeah.
We can be surrendered to our own ego. Then we are in continuous misery because our soul will not allow it.
Yeah.
And actually, the more misery we have, the better it is, because the earlier we will learn that it doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
So we surrender in any case. The question is, to what do we surrender? Do we surrender to the divine, or do we surrender to something small? If we surrender to something small, we may succeed, and then that is our bad luck, because then it takes longer. Or we may not succeed, then that is our good luck, because then we go on fighting and thinking and struggling, and maybe we realize that we have to go through something beyond it.
Yes. And I mean, Sri Aurobindo in his Secret of the Vedas expresses this in terms of the offering either to the gods or to the forces of the Dasyus, no? Either we are offering to the gods that will take us towards our greater light, or we are by default offering to those forces that will keep us constrained.
Small. Yeah.
Very, very interesting. So, I mean, these are books that I really recommend that our participants look into. The Synthesis of Yoga, Sri Aurobindo's The Secret of the Veda. We'll talk about these references because people were asking about some of them as well. But there was one very important question, a little bit linked to the previous answer you gave by Raghavan Ayarji, who's saying that, how do I know I am in the right train and that I have reached my destination?
The mother says that once you are in the right train, you will know. But it is a bit risky, because sometimes you think you are in the right one, but you are not. When you reach the divine, you know you reach the divine. There's no doubt possible, because there's perfection. And if you get it wrong, you stumble later. You realize that you're wrong. So you can pretend, you can deceive yourself, but not for eternity. Sooner or later, you figure out that you were mistaken. So you have to go on aspiring, and the more honest you are, the longer your misery, and the greater your joy at the end of the story.
So I guess we need to change our lens of reading misery as necessary.
Yeah. You have to see misery as a stepping stone, as something that's extremely useful. But that is tough. One thing that you definitely need is bravery, because all our trouble is due to ego, and then to some level of cowardice. We try to escape the problem. We try to make a fortress of the little life we have. And then our fortress turns out to be a jail. In the Middle Ages, they made these castles, and they made jails also. And they looked exactly the same. The castle you make for yourself is quite like a jail. Yeah.
There's a sort of related question to that by Forum Trivediji, who's again saying that sometimes in this condition of desperation, we humans start feeling very numb and hollow, and it almost feels like life is sucked out of us. We can't feel anything. How can we use this divine knowledge to revive us?
The thing is that when you feel hollow, you actually are. At least your surface nature hasn't got it. So it is a positive start. You have to realize that something is missing. Otherwise, you live happily along and nothing happens, and you don't get 1 iota wiser. So you have to kind of embrace that emptiness, realize there's a truth in it, and wait for it to fill up. The divine cannot hide. There is that old story of Akbar, no, where Akbar asks, who is more powerful, Allah or me? And everybody is in big trouble because nobody wants to, if they disagree with Akbar, then they are in trouble now. If they say something wrong about Allah, then they are in trouble afterwards. And the answer is, Akbar is more powerful because he can throw people out of his kingdom. Allah cannot do that. Yeah? There's a Chinese story which says that however far you jump, you can never jump out of God's hand. Everything, whatever you do, you still stay within his kingdom. So you may feel hollow, but you are surrounded by the ocean. And at some stage you have to open up to that.
Grateful for
The divine cannot disappear. You can close yourself. You can keep up an illusion of stupidity, which we are very good at. Huh? We can do that for lives at end. But in the end, it will not work.
I mean, that's a very reassuring message that you've given of being held no matter what. And there is that famous story also of the footsteps on the sand.
Similar story. There are 3 very similar stories.
Yes.
The first time I heard that story about the hand, I was very, very much touched. There's a Chinese story about a monkey who is playing havoc in heaven. So the great Buddha takes him on her hand and then tells, if you can jump out of my hand, then you can become the king, you're great. And he thinks he can jump very, very far. But in the end, he has just reached a little further on that same hand because he cannot jump out of Buddha's hand. Yeah, that is the saving grace, actually. Yeah.
I'll just take up there are many wonderful questions. As always, we've got a very, very keen audience and they give a lot of food for thought as well. You know, we have the session and then we have an almost equal length of another session just with the very thought-provoking questions that are asked. So another question is on, is science and spirituality complementary or contradictory in the journey of exploring consciousness?
Ideally, it should be complementary, obviously. If people are stupid, then it is contradictory. And they tend to deny each other. But if science is open, then it cannot deny the existence of consciousness. The problem is science started as a choice. When science started, it kind of decided to leave God to religion, to the church, and to explore only the physical reality. Descartes was very clear that he only would study the measurable universe. But the world does not contain only the measurable world. The world contains also the measuring consciousness. And so I think to get at the truth, both systems have to reach beyond themselves. Science has the good part that it is never stuck to its findings. It knows that everything that it knows is temporary. But it tends to get stuck to its method. And the method for measuring the measurable universe is different than the method for finding your own subjectivity. And science tends to ignore the subjective side. It takes it kind of for granted. And because we are so different in our consciousness from the physical world, there is a kind of objectivity. There is sufficient distance to look at the physical reality as it really is. With consciousness, there's a bigger problem because our mind stands in between. So if we look with the mind at the mind, we don't get it. It is like a judge giving a judgment about his own family. He cannot be objective. If you want to study the human mind, you have to stand further back. So you have to get to that pure consciousness. So for the study of consciousness, you have to improve your inner instrument of study. In an interesting way, it is somewhat like how we studied astronomy. In astronomy, you cannot do that many experiments. You cannot create stars and planets and all that to your wishes. You have to make better and better instruments. Sometimes you make much better instruments. Sometimes you study in detail the errors your instruments make and you deduct those errors from your observations. For the study of psychology, we have to do the same thing. We have to make our own inner instrument of knowledge perfect. And if it is not getting perfect, we have to know exactly the biases it introduces and then deduct those. And that's what the Indian tradition has done. So I think they're complementary in a very strong sense, but both of them have to be honest about their premature conclusions and to be genuinely open. If they do that, then all is fine, because in their essence, they're both honest attempts at getting at truth. So as long as that prevails, and they're not defensive about defending their own methods and their own tradition and their own knowledge and then it is fine. But at the moment, I've seen that in spirituality, way too many people are defensive about their own path. Even if you bring people from different traditions together, they rarely try to listen to each other and see what the other tradition knows that they don't know. It's very rare. Maybe because it takes so much time to really understand Buddhism or Patanjali or Shankara or whatever. So when we have achieved that, we don't want to hear anything that contradicts it, because we have already put so much effort. So we want to keep the little we have, because that's already quite a lot. But if we want to bring that kind of total open-endedness, which is there originally in yoga, which is there definitely originally in science, then they're actually the same approach in different fields. And we may find that it is actually one field. No, like if consciousness is really the stuff that makes all physical objects do what they're supposed to do, then we may find out how it actually works. If we stick to the little that we know, then they are completely apart and they will never meet. But there has to be a lot of openness on both sides. And I think it is generally missing. But it cannot continue missing because both systems are clearly not good enough. Science is definitely not good enough because life makes no sense if it was only physical. That really doesn't cut for it. The spiritual traditions are more difficult because they are more satisfying when you reach the end. So you can easily have the sense that you have found it, so that's it. But we have to retain that openness. Yeah.
It's interesting because we have Anju ji who's saying that, it's not even necessary that you have two schools of thought that need to differ with each other. Even within the same school, people are not able to sometimes accept each other's approach.
Yeah. Not sometimes, almost all the time. I happen to live in Pondicherry and we have the sea. So in the morning, the sun rises. Yeah. It's not that the earth tumbles down. The sun actually rises in the morning. So inevitably, there is a ray of light from the sun directly to us. Yeah? But obviously, that ray of light comes exactly to me. It doesn't come to the person who stands even a few meters to the left or right of me. That ray of light comes to me alone. And if I walk along the beach, that ray of light follows me. It is visually completely obvious. These other people may think that they see the sun, but that ray of reflection in the water, but they must be cheating because that ray of light comes only to me. Now we all know that this is rubbish, but in spirituality, it is a little more tricky because you can really feel that the way you know the divine is actually better than the way everybody else knows it. You have to be very cool about your own mind and your own feelings and your own existence to accept that the whole sea is lighted up. And that it is just your bad luck that you see only that one streak that goes to the sun. I once calculated how much more light the sun actually radiates than what I can see of it. Yeah? We have only these tiny eyes, a few millimeters square, the opening. And the sun radiates light that is something like 10 to the power 26, 28, 10 to the power 28. So 28 zeros after the one. More powerful, more radiation than what I can ever see with my eyes. So what I think is the divine is intrinsically completely rubbish. I mean, it is for me very big. But compared to the divine, it is very, very small. But for me, it is very big. So it's definitely much bigger than it is for you, obviously. It's difficult to get completely out of that ego. And you see it, unfortunately, in many, many great men, that they still have that ego, that they think that they actually know it better than anybody else. It comes super easily. I also have it. Yeah.
Said listening to you is such a soul nourishing experience because we connect with so many deeper truths in ourselves. Very nostalgic about those times at IPI and many discussions that we've had. Just want to also mention to our audience here that Matthijs Bhai is also one of the founding fathers of the Indian psychology movement that started in 2001. No?
Yeah, a little earlier actually, in the end of 1999. It started in the US as usual. But the basic idea is that mainstream psychology is actually scandalously inappropriate. The whole idea to change the study of psychology to the study of behavior is awful. And the worst is that it is the foundational science of education. When you are manipulated, when you're not recognized as a person, when you're treated as an object, you feel bad, and rightly so, because you're not an object, you're a subject. And our whole educational system is an applied science that takes people as objects. Very consciously, if I can call that consciously, psychology decided in the beginning of last century to become a science of behavior. And they have now added experience and consciousness and but it is still not wholehearted. It is still trying to be objective about it. And when you try to be objective about people, you do a fundamental injustice to who they are. And our educational system is based on that. Which means that all of us have gone for the most pliable years of our lives through a system that doesn't recognize who we are. It is really terrifying. And if we could set that educational system right, the whole world would become infinitely better. And for that, we have to set our psychology right. At the moment, all yoga systems are kind of external to mainstream psychology. They should become internal to it. Seriously, not in the sense that we try to do objective science about yoga. Then we are still missing the point. We should be rigorously subjective in our science of human beings. But anyhow, that's another story probably.
Now, you've also been the co-founder of the Mirambika School, because you spoke of the
Yeah.
importance of providing a whole different framework of education, also based on Mother and Sri Aurobindo's integral education philosophy. Again, from their standpoint, how is it that we can really open our listening? Because you were talking of the fact of not getting stuck. In the previous question, you were talking about how do you not get stuck on a certain way of looking at things. So what kind of education can help us retain our openness to everything? What does Sri Aurobindo propose in that line?
If you tell it in terms of yoga, then it is that education should be based on our soul. And now that's very difficult because it requires that the teachers know their own soul before they can really understand the soul of the children. But that's where you have to start. But in practice, almost everything will get settled in order if you just start with respect for children. Children are told, in India at least, forever to be respectful to their elders. But to change education, what it's very much needed is that teachers respect the students. And that respect should be as radical as they can get it out of their hearts to do. So education is completely maniacal about evaluation. And education will go far better if you stop doing that, or only do it when students want it. Or maybe do it as an entrance exam to the next layer or something like that, but not continuously. Because children are clever, they know what the teacher wants to hear, so they tell that, then they forget what they think. And if you do it the other way around, and if you just have respect for students, allow them to learn what they want to learn in the way they want to learn it, it works marvelously. And the great fun of Mirambika, the school that we try to set up, was that it actually works. If you don't try to pour knowledge into the poor kids, into their heads as if they're just buckets or something, and if you allow them to ask questions, grow, develop in the way they think is best, they learn faster, they learn way more, and whatever they learn becomes really part of themselves. It works. I have no doubt that it works. And the main thing teachers have to learn is to stand back. Really respect the children. Try to understand why they say what they say. And not hammer them into the shape they want to give to the children. Because they don't need to do that. Children grow far better when you trust them in their wisdom and their way of growing. That really works.
I said, you spoke my heart when you said that we need to get rid of the evaluation system, because teaching here at IIT, this question really comes up very often as to what really are we evaluating, and are they really learning anything? And it's a very complicated thing. But also when you're saying that, you have to allow children to find their own voice, I think it has to really be something that starts very, very early on.
Yeah, that has to start very early. Ideally, it should be there with the parents.
Yes.
And we had in Mirambika that if children had been, say, 6 months in a normal school, it would take about a year before they would have their own spontaneity back.
Unschooling them.
And unschooling takes longer than schooling.
Yes. Yes. But
it may be okay for technical subjects. There is an element of just content which you either get or you don't get. But even there, if you leave children more free to study things that are in harmony with them, they learn much better. Yeah. And if you try to impose, it doesn't really work. At best, children learn to ape sentences, and it serves hardly any purpose. Yeah.
I'll just come back to another set of questions, and this is more related to the sense of coherence. So we have somebody's asking that, can you comment about the sense of coherence that people need to feel that the world is understandable, manageable, and meaningful to our spiritual evolution? We have a related question by Debra Uberji, who's again a very regular attendee of this program. She's saying a split is occurring, a split that perhaps always has been there, but personally I feel alienated from humankind, the cruelty and now the genocide and moving into social control. How do you survive in a world where social control will take over? I have asked this before, but it's a question that makes her anxious, and thank you for your calm presence. So if you would like to connect those two. And maybe I'll throw in a third one, which is about the subconscious. What role does the subconscious play in Sri Aurobindo's philosophy? So that's a very big khichdi that I've put in front of you to make me.
Okay. To some extent, I think the only way out is realize that for everybody, the ultimate problem is the ego. As long as you think of yourself as a small creature in a huge and somewhat dubious and dangerous world, you are in trouble. And you will ultimately lose. However your life goes, it ends. So as long as you have that identification with your smallness, you've had it. It's as simple as that. So you have somehow to find that thing which is eternal. Once you find that in your deepest essence, you are free, nothing can ever happen to you. Because whatever happens is just something that happens, passes. So if you reach that level, then you have a kind of foundation. You have a kind of certainty. And the good thing is that it is there. So the only thing needed is to somehow free it from the coverings. You see, in the evening, the sun sets. As everything that we have in life is dependent on the sun, it would be quite reasonable for humans to start crying and be in a panic at sunset. But nobody is, or very few people are. Almost everybody recognizes something of eternity at sunset. And whether it is that deep down we know that the sun sets and will rise again a few hours later, but somehow that setting of the sun connects us to our eternity. As long as the sun shines, we live at the moment. The sunset forces us to find that truth that will survive till the next day. And somehow we have to find that thing that survives the trouble, that survives the panic, that survives torture and all the cruelty that we will encounter in life. So we have to find that. And it is there. You murdered one life, you're born again. There's no way you can go because you're made from stardust, you're made from the divine. So your body can go, your ego will go, definite. But you will not go. And the moment you get a little bit of experience of that eternity, the kind of terror, the kind of panic goes. Sri Aurobindo has written a very long poem, Savitri. It is one of the longest poems in English. 728 pages or something like that, 724, I think. And to quite an extent, it is about the conquest of death. And at the end, death is defeated. And there's a very beautiful sentence. It says that the asuras, basically, the demons, that they wept with joy because they realized that the end of their terrible task was near. Yeah, all these negative things are there in the end to polish us, to rub us, to make sure that we go to the essence and don't get stuck on too low a level. If everything was honky-dory, we would just eat our samosas or ice creams, be happy, pass from one day to the next, and life would continue. It would not get any better. So all these terrible things are there because we have to wake up. We have to look for something better. It is an unpleasant way. And the moment you realize that infinity really solidly with your whole nature, then you don't need the suffering anymore. But as long as you have an ego, as long as you identify with small things, you need something to force you to move. And the problem is that we defend our smallness. All of us do. It doesn't look like, but somewhere we are fond of our suffering because there's the thing we know best. It's kind of safe. Miserable, but safe. We have somehow to let it go, to let it become part of the past. And you will see that if you manage that, if you really grow out of it, you will realize that all the suffering you've ever had served a purpose. It made you grow in a way that you would not have done if you had not had that pain beforehand. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, but it is like this. And the pain is really relative. Even physically, one of the biggest problems a person can have is not to feel pain. You have some people who never feel pain. There's something anatomically missing. They have a very difficult life because they can get all kinds of terrible injuries and they don't even realize. So they have to be constantly on their guard. It is a tough assignment. It's not ideal at all. But you have to be brave. And most of us are not very brave. We would like to escape. We would like to be safe somewhere. Reasonably enough. But we are forced to find that safety on a higher and higher level. I don't know if you can hear the sound of the temple bell. There's a tiny, tiny temple just next to the place where I'm now sitting. There's a priest who does not have much of musical talent, I'm afraid. In about a minute, it will take over. So if you have, Anuradha, if you have something to say for about a minute, we don't need to listen to this.
No, I was just saying there is this beautiful quote by Sri Aurobindo where he says, "Pain is the hammer of the gods to break a dead resistance in the mortal's heart."
It is exactly that, yeah.
Yes. And yes. And you also spoke about reincarnation. So we had a question about, that the reincarnation seems to be a necessary idea for the evolution of consciousness. There are faith traditions that do not accept this concept, but consider that there is only one lifetime and the way to heaven is through faith in God. Can this be reconciled with with your ideas of evolution of consciousness by saying that believers within these faith traditions have made the jump within their one lifetime?
Wow, that would be grand. Then I will immediately join one of those. No, I don't think it works like that. See, organized religion is a very tricky affair. And to to survive as an organization, you often have to do things and make compromises with the inner teaching. I learned to my great surprise, which I didn't know when I was younger, that the Jewish tradition, both the folk tradition and the old scriptures, fully believe in reincarnation. It's part of the tradition. And there are many indications of it. And they say that Christianity also had it fully accepted as part of the story. Till a moment in the Roman times, when the Roman politicians made an objection against it because it made people disobedient. And they insisted. And the church kind of decided to accept the one life theory, partially to placate the politicians at that time. It is a historical moment. The texts are there. It's factual. And so this whole idea that we finish in one life may be a kind of official doctrine that is promoted to keep the faith together. The problem with organized religion is that they very often have to make a compromise with the truth, like politicians do. And there is an underlying tradition which is quite different. So I'm told that at one stage that even the cardinals, the inner circle of the Roman Catholic Church, actually accepts reincarnation. But the church made at once, the Roman Catholic Church especially, made at one stage a very conscious decision that the church as a body would take over the karma of the individual believers. The idea being that that would keep the mass safe and happy, and the few people who could bear it would take the responsibility. And I give that for whatever it is.
Can I?
But, yeah.
No, please.
I think that the percentage of people in Europe that believes in reincarnation is increasing every year. And it was already 10 years back or so, it was already 30%. And it goes on increasing. I think that just too many people who have experienced these experiences that are way easier to explain with reincarnation than without it. And if you see how children are born, that's one of the great privileges of doing medical studies, that you see at some stage a lot of children born, and every child is different. We are not empty slates. Everybody starts with a story. Some children are full of thought. When they are born, they're immediately thinking like anything. What the heck has happened to them? Others are blissful. Some are very curious. I've seen one child who was furious when he was born. Angry. Just couldn't stand it. Everybody has a story. And the story does not start with your birthday, your first birthday. It doesn't. That just doesn't cook it. That's just not good enough.
And I mean, that was a very beautiful way of making us aware of the reality that, as you said, the story doesn't start when we are born on earth. Evident.
That just doesn't hold. That is too crude an idea.
All right. I would just like to, I mean, it's unfortunate that this, like many of our great sessions, it's unfortunate that we also have to press the pause button at some point. But it would be complete injustice if I press the pause button without asking a very important question to you, which has been voiced by some of our participants as well. And that is about Sri Aurobindo's role in this journey of evolution. What has he really said more? So we have Sunil Kumarji who's saying, what is the role of overmind and superconscious as described by Sri Aurobindo? And we have Dr. Jaiprakash Gupta, another very frequent attendee of this program, who's saying that, do you think Satprem's Adventures of Consciousness reflect Sri Aurobindo's framework? And how is it different from current thinkers? And now how and when is a synthesis possible? And because you have looked at various traditions, various teachings, and come to Sri Aurobindo, and you believe that that is something very significant that he's adding to the story of the evolution of consciousness. If you would like to just shed some light on that.
This is a very, very difficult question, and which I'm not competent to answer. So I would strongly advise that you read Sri Aurobindo himself. For psychological stuff, basically the synthesis of yoga. If you have a little bit of poetic opening, Savitri, which is that long poem, and there's much, much more. He has written quite a lot. Satprem has got something, but it is mixed. So he has definitely got something, but he has also introduced a lot of smallness that just came from his personal history. So you cannot trust him the way you can trust Sri Aurobindo and the mother. They have a kind of vastness that Satprem didn't have. But this is a very personal thing, and Sri Aurobindo doesn't come in conflict with other traditions or your individual guru. He really changed, I think, the basic story. So he provides a kind of meta framework in which you can understand all these smaller approaches, which may yet be crucial for you as a person. Because we are all somewhere else, and we have to grow from wherever we are. And Sri Aurobindo has offered that vast framework for the whole enterprise. Now, if you're interested in that vast framework, then wonderful. I don't think it's there for everybody. And he never tried to compete with other gurus or get disciples or anything like that. He had no interest whatsoever. He just realized that we are at one of those radical changes. And he gives the indication of in which direction that change is going. So if you want to know beforehand a little bit what's going to happen, then that's wonderful. But it will happen by itself. And yeah, I think the best we can do is just be as honest with ourselves as we can, and be as open as we can, and not stick to the past. Not stick to all our old defenses, because in the end they're all defenses. Let that go and open up to something much more beautiful. And if you look at history, there have been big changes, huh? Just say in the Indian tradition, you have this tradition, this change over from Ram to Krishna, from kind of law and order to a kind of freedom, which is very similar to the Christian change from Moses to Christ. Very similar. And we may now be again to something wider. There is no reason to believe that there were religions, say more than 6,000, 10,000 years ago. With a bit of luck, all the religions are from about 2,000 years back and after. Maybe a little more, not much more. So maybe we have come to a state where we can see that the world is huge, and that we just have to try to be as open as we can, understand as much as we can, and limit ourselves as little as we can. And enjoy that fullness, that richness, and the beauty of harmony. And there are positive signs. For example, we have always had in most societies that battle between conservative parties and more democratic parties. And in many countries, the parties that are at the moment winning are actually gaining, not yet winning, but gaining, are the green parties, which is is not political. It is an attempt at creating harmony with ourselves, with nature, with everything. But we are at that turning point. In many countries, there has been a marginal, just there are, all the elections are almost 50-50. And very often the rogues win. So still something drastic has to change. But for that, people have to wake up. Everybody has to realize. And at one stage, it will just flip. But it is in process. The one thing we can be 100% sure is that in another 20 years or 30 years, the world will not be as it is now. There's just no way. We cannot continue in the same direction. And Sri Aurobindo has indicated an incredibly beautiful future. And the interesting thing is that over his life, he got more and more convinced that that was not just a possibility, but something that was just given, just an automatic consequence of how the whole world has been made. So that this next step in the evolution is not just a possibility, but is something that's just is destined, is going to happen.
Can you just elaborate on that beautiful dream that Sri Aurobindo laid out?
See, basically, it is that our minds are intrinsically dual and small. That's just the layer of consciousness that we have. Yeah? Someone asked earlier whether there are layers of consciousness. The layer of consciousness of matter is simple. It is solidly tamasic. It continues doing whatever it is doing. And it does that perfectly. It is good that it is there. Otherwise, we couldn't even stay here. We wouldn't have any physical base to stay on. The consciousness of life is different. It promotes itself. It is into self-assertion, into growth, into generosity, interactions, love, all that kind of stuff. But also in egoism, in fighting. Because it's self-assertion. It is not bothered about truth or any of those difficult things. Then you have the mind, which wants to understand. But it creates a constructed knowledge. Because it is a biologically founded knowledge. It is the kind of knowledge that our brains produce. And the fun thing is that modernity has figured out more or less, not yet at all properly, but a little bit, how the mind is doing it. So we know everything about how avijja works, because we can even imitate it in computers to some extent. Not yet remotely fully, but to some extent. But the world has not been created out of that consciousness. It cannot be, because for that it is way too complicated, way too beautiful, way too great a harmony. So we can already open ourselves to that greater consciousness. And then maybe learn how to express that, how to give it a form, how to build an educational system on it, how to build a political system on it, how to improve the very basics of economics, which at the moment are horribly crude. So if we allow that other consciousness to permeate, to seep into our individual existence and in our collective existence, things are bound to improve. And there may be a flipping point. There may be something that suddenly things will start showing. So that's the basic idea. But it is still open. Huh? You have to open your mind. You cannot define it. It's like Arjuna asking Krishna to show the divine. You cannot do that. If you could, then you could imitate it, and that would spoil it. You have to get that inner opening.
Can you just give us a glimpse of the supramental? Because Sri Aurobindo, I think, is one of the first ones in the recent past, at least, who spoke about the next step of evolution as the supramental being. Could you just shed a little bit, could you just explain that a little bit in detail? I know this is the whole topic, it's a whole topic for another few sessions, not just one.
Even in a few sessions, I would not be able to do it because I don't have enough of it. I have just the faintest of glimpses. I can just mentally fully understand that it has to come, and I have sufficient experience to be pretty sure about it. But no, then I have really to refer to passages in Savitri and so. Basically, to write, it is infinitely easier to write about problems than to write about goodness. In theater, there's things that are easy to depict are the villains. The good people are very difficult to depict. But Sri Aurobindo has taken the trouble of trying to show how that fully harmonious life will be, where everybody knows his oneness with everybody else, where everybody knows that it is like that, and where we will not anymore be limited to our senses. Because our senses produce, just very simply, physically, what we see of the world is all reflected light. Within the limited range that our eyes can produce. We cannot even imagine a color outside of the range that we can see. And obviously those colors are there because things radiate in all kinds of directions. It's not just the colors that we happen to see and enjoy. So if we would know things for what they are, and maybe it is easier to begin with to know each other as we are. Maybe the easiest is to begin to know ourselves as we are and look at ourselves also more from inside out than from outside in. And then we may get in contact with everything as it is from inside. Kind of try to understand how things also feel from themselves out. And how the divine feels the world as a whole. And for that, our own thinking has to stop because it stands in the way. We have to keep quiet and allow that bigger harmony to come in. But really, I cannot give you a detailed description of the supramental because I have too little experience of it. And even if I had, I couldn't do it. So I think here we are really all, in a way, on our own. But the good thing is that consciousness is contagious. So you gain from being with people who have been a little bit further on the road. And but in the end, you have to make your own connection with the divine and get it direct. And that's possible because the connection is there. We are made of that same stuff. We have just to let that old way of knowing go. Yeah. But by all means, read Sri Aurobindo if you have any chance to do. But again, it may not be everybody's path. I'm sure that there are a lot of people who are on this path who have never heard of Sri Aurobindo and don't need his text either, because they are on that path. And we are all connected to the divine, whether in whatever way. We are, because we are part of that. So we don't need these explicit teachings anymore. Maybe that's just actually outdated.
We have Golok Nandaji, who's actually almost has a follow-up to what you've said. He's saying, I've not studied Sri Aurobindo's teachings. People say he was a great philosopher and it's very difficult to understand his teachings and writings. My question is that he's asking for a brief understanding of Sri Aurobindo's, but if you could just maybe guide people towards an easy access to Sri Aurobindo's thoughts.
An easy, see the mother who worked in the ashram and lived, she had more or less the same level of understanding as Sri Aurobindo, but she talked mainly with children. And her language is very, very much easier to understand. So there are many people who find her writings way easier. One difficulty is this, that she didn't write books. So she just talked to groups of children and she spoke what they needed to hear at that moment. So you cannot have there's no consistent, any of her writings that are on this subject or that subject. But people have made compilations. So a very good way to start with is the various compilations that A.S. Dalal has made, like Living Within or The Psychic Being. They have short passages, both from Mother and from Sri Aurobindo, selected, in Sri Aurobindo's case, very often from his letters, because they're simple and in a very short space explain something basic. And these compilations are very helpful. Then when you get a little in it, then you can try to decipher Sri Aurobindo's writings. They're difficult because they're Victorian English. His sentences are huge. So you have to get into it. When you take that trouble, it's worth it. But in the beginning, it's very daunting. But those compilations are a very good entry. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes. Could you also tell our participants to how they can reach out to you, a little bit about IPI?
The best is probably simply to have a look at the IPI website, literally IPI, India, Pakistan, India, .org, short for organization, and then .in. So ipi.org.in. And there is all kind of material there.
Yes. So I'll request Vinaya, I mean, we are extremely grateful for what you have shared with us. And we are also very grateful to the audience for having stayed with us, because obviously they were finding your sharings very meaningful. And one participant even said that it was like an awakening call. Thank you very much for that. So
thank you for inviting me here for sharing. As you know, I was very hesitant whether to participate or not, but the questions and answers are always better because they come from an urge to know, no? So that's nice.
So I'd like to request Vinay to please make the announcements for tomorrow. Oh no, for the rest of the day, not tomorrow. I've traveled in time.
All right. So thank you.
No,
thank
we'll
you
be
all.
back. We'll be back. Don't leave. We'll be back to you again.
Okay, I'll wait.
Thank you, Matthijs Bhai, for sharing such deep insights and your wisdom. You have always been so generous in sharing. Thank you for that. And also thank you for pushing us out of our comfort zones. It's so easy to get into comfort zones, to become complacent, even on the spiritual path in this journey that we have undertaken. So, and this was really a good kick just to keep our eyes wide open, to understand, to question, to keep that sense of inquiry active. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for being there. Yeah.
I request Srinivasji, Kotiji to kindly present us the events of the day. So at the noon, we have Miss Melinda, a good friend, who will be presenting on Satipatthana meditation as an opportunity for Santosha. Satipatthana is a Pali word for Smriti Upasthana, which means mindfulness. A very popular practice in the Buddhist traditions. So she is the assistant professor at Dharma Gate Buddhist College in Budapest. So she will be leading this session. It is both a practical session and an interaction session. So kindly do join us for this. In the evening, we have Sri Ravi Manthaji, who is a holistic healer, health activist, author, and the founder of Sage Sustainable Living and Baby Elephant Permaculture Farm. He will be leading a session on 7-layer therapy, a holistic approach to lifelong well-being. One of his recent books, The Baby Elephant Diet, is quite popular, which tells us about the way the nutrition or the kind of food that we need to take, which helps us in these times. So that's a very popular book, and he will be presenting before us this evening. So do stay with us and continue this journey along with us up to 31st July. And these are the events for the day. And I also would like to mention that all these sessions are recorded and they're available on Indica Yoga YouTube channel, because what you heard in this 1.5 hours is something that you really would have to go over it a few times, and therefore that is available. So please make use of it. And all the events, future events, are also presented on Indica Yoga website. So kindly mark your schedules accordingly and join us for all these sessions. And with this, we come back to Matthijs Bhai. What would you like to share as a parting message? Something, especially in terms of sadhana, because you really opened our eyes to some areas which we would have taken for granted. So keeping that in the backdrop, any one message for practice or a guideline, anything that you would like to share as you feel inspired at the moment?
I would just, Vinay, if I may just say that we've also had friends from across the world. Vladimir also was there on Facebook listening to what you said, and he's thanked you for your very nice and deep thoughts. So this connection that you have established is also very beautiful. So kindly share your thoughts on. how to take it forward?
I think the best we can do is try to be as open as possible to the divine consciousness that is our very essence and is the essence of the whole manifestation. And just get out of the way. Learn to open us up to open ourselves up to that inner reality. And then learn to express that better and better. That beauty is there, so we can find it and we can learn to express it better. It is a long search, but very much worth it. Happy journey.
Yes. And if I may just take on the thread from there and read a passage from the Mother, where she's saying that at the moment we are at a decisive turning point in the history of the earth once again. From every side I am asked, what is going to happen? Everywhere there is anguish, expectation, fear. What is going to happen? There is only one reply. If only man could consent to be spiritualized. And perhaps it would be enough if some individuals became pure gold. But this would be enough to change the course of events. We are faced with this necessity in a very urgent way. This courage, this heroism, which the divine wants of us, why not use it to fight against one's own difficulties, one's own imperfections, one's own obscurities? Why not heroically face the furnace of inner purification so that it does not become necessary to pass once more through one of those terrible, gigantic destructions which plunge an entire civilization into darkness? This is the problem before us. It is for each one to solve it in his own way.
Thank you.
I would like to thank all our participants who have joined us and stayed with us for this long. And we also have friends from IPI family, IPI alumnus who have done various courses who have joined us. So thanks to each one of them.